That's what it sounds like when Russian drones strike targets in Kiev. In Ukraine, Russia has learned how to deploy drones in large numbers and across long distances. They are cheap, difficult to intercept, and militarily effective. The Kremlin is now demonstrating those capabilities beyond Ukraine as well, though in different ways than on the battlefield there. Russian drones have already appeared in European NATO countries too.
Breaking news out of Poland. The military there accusing Moscow of an act of aggression after Polish and NATO forces scrambled to shoot down Russian drones that violated its airspace.
This was a CNN report from September 2025. At the time, the drones were shot down by Western fighter jets. No one was injured. But if Russia and NATO were in a direct military confrontation, things could look very different. At the end of the last episode, you heard the Russian team discuss an attack plan against Germany. And in that plan, drones play an essential role. But first, let's start with a quick recap of where we stand in the war game. It is late October 2026. The Red Team, Russia, has invaded southern Lithuania and established a corridor between Belarus and Kaliningrad. At this point, a quick reminder that everything you are hearing is fictional. The US, NATO's most important member, is effectively out of the picture. Germany and the other Europeans are on their own. The German Chancellor and his ministers have responded to the Russian incursion with tough economic sanctions and measures targeting Russia's shadow fleet. Together with other NATO countries, Germany now wants to monitor the Baltic Sea so closely that Russian ships and aircraft can no longer move freely there. In addition, the German parliament has declared what is known as a state of tension, a constitutional emergency measure that automatically brings back military conscription. The Red Team does not yet know about these decisions, but it is about to find out.
We still have plenty of arrows left in the quiver. Plenty of ways to escalate further if we have to.
One of these arrows is aimed at Germany. My name is Carolina Drüten. I'm the international security correspondent at the German media outlet WELT. This is Ernstfall. What if Russia attacks NATO? Inside a German war game. Episode 4. Europe without America.
As part of my planning, I have also developed a detailed attack plan against Germany. It focuses primarily on Germany's logistics hubs and critical infrastructure. On the one hand, I'd target them with missile strikes, with ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. Then there'd be long-range drone attacks. We now have that capability as a result of the war in Ukraine. At the same time, there'd be, of course, terrorist and sabotage operations as part of the hybrid campaign.
That was the Russian military chief. He is referring to the capabilities Russia has developed during the war in Ukraine, particularly its ability to strike targets hundreds of kilometers behind the front line with drones. His conclusion is clear. Germany is vulnerable.
Here, I would rely primarily on what is known as a saturation strategy. Germany's air and missile defenses are very limited. They simply don't have enough interceptor missiles. They have virtually no effective counter-drone capabilities. At the moment, Germany has no credible military response to an attack on that scale.
These plans are based on a scenario in which NATO resorts to collective defense, for example by launching a counter-offensive against Russian forces in Lithuania overland through Poland. That would mean up to hundreds of thousands of Allied troops moving across Germany on their way to the front line. From Russia's perspective, the priority would then be to cripple that logistical lifeline. The Russian military chief already has specific targets in mind.
I would carry out precision strikes against the rail infrastructure and the port of Bremerhaven, which is the main entry point for heavy US equipment. I would also target the LNG terminals in Wilhelmshaven and Lubmin. At the same time, we would activate sleeper cells to sabotage key rail links. Another option would be drone attacks against individual commercial vessels in the North Sea and against offshore wind farms to disrupt the power supply. And finally, drone strikes against major industrial hubs.
An attack on Germany is not a decision the Red Team has already taken. It is a contingency plan. One they are keeping in reserve in case Berlin and NATO, from Moscow's perspective, go too far.
I think this option I've just outlined should be part of the negotiations as a threat. I don't think we need to implement it within the first 24 hours, but we should keep it in reserve.
The Russian foreign minister agrees.
When it comes to Germany, it's best to stick to the tried and tested strategy of carrot and stick. For now, we're showing the stick, not yet using it, with all the measures you've just outlined.
Behind the players, on a screen hanging on the wall, the blue team's decisions are now appearing. The German Wargaming Center, which runs the adjudication of the exercise, has staff in both rooms. Whenever one team takes a decision, it is passed on to the other side. The three men on the Russian team are now reacting to Germany's latest moves.
What I find interesting are these relatively tough economic measures. We're essentially trying to lure them in, and they are deliberately doing the opposite, not engaging with that at all, but instead escalating in the economic sphere.
What's interesting is that there's not a single measure here to reinforce NATO's troop presence. In the end, the forces NATO currently has in the Baltics simply aren't sufficient to disrupt our corridor.
The blue team has adopted tough economic measures. But from the Russian perspective, none of them threatens Moscow's core objective.
Our objective right now is simply to get this corridor through. Once we've done that, we are in a completely different world. And somehow all of this misses the point.
Maybe their goal is simply to show that they're acting, that they're strong, that they're sending a strong signal, but they're not actually solving the problem.
The military chief now turns his attention to the Baltic Sea. Germany and the other NATO countries bordering the Baltic have decided to monitor it so closely that Russia can no longer use it freely for military operations. There's little Moscow can do about that.
From a purely military perspective, we're actually inferior to NATO in the Baltic Sea. I wouldn't commit too many resources to trying to break through NATO's A2AD bubble there. Instead, I'd focus on what countermeasures are available to us.
One option, he says, would be to isolate Lithuania by sea.
For example, we could impose a naval blockade by sending special forces from Russia's Baltic fleet to lay offensive minefields in the approaches to the port of Klaipėda.
But the Russian president sees no reason to escalate any further, at least for now.
I wouldn't do that at this stage.
No, okay.
It's good that we have these plans.
Okay.
But for now, we're not using them. We stay calm. Nobody is doing anything about the humanitarian corridor. Everything's fine.
I think our interest right now is to buy time and not allow ourselves to get distracted by side issues. The most important thing for the other side should have been to secure unity between America and Europe. Instead, Germany in particular has focused entirely on itself, the state of tension, conscription, and so on. None of that is really relevant in a crisis that is moving this fast.
We've effectively attacked a NATO country, and Germany has not responded forcefully.
One of Germany's decisions, however, is beginning to concern the Russian president.
There is one thing that really annoys me. This naval blockade of our shadow fleet. We need to respond to that. We can't ignore it. This is basically an act of war, and everything else, I don't care.
The Red Team decides to call a meeting at the United Nations Security Council, accusing NATO of what it calls aggression in the Baltic Sea. As a permanent member of the Council, Russia has the right to put items on the agenda. The president suggests a second measure.
Maybe we should put out a statement saying that from now on, all ships heading to Russia or transporting Russian goods will be escorted by our Navy. That's what we'll do.
In other words, Russia raises the cost of Germany's decision. From now on, Russian warships will escort the tankers of the Shadow Fleet. Any attempt by NATO countries to inspect them could now escalate into a direct military confrontation. In the room next door, the blue team is informed of Russia's move and immediately realizes what that means. The Chancellor is the first to raise the issue.
Civilian shipping is now under the escort of the Russian Navy.
Including the Shadow Fleet?
Definitely.
Perhaps we should sink one of their ships.
Behind the Chancellor's pointed remark lies a tricky question. If Russia starts protecting its tankers with warships, how far is Germany actually prepared to go to enforce its own decisions?
The question that arises for me is, if we stick to this course of action, and in the future, Shadow Fleet vessels are escorted by the Russian Navy, are we prepared to stop these ships regardless? After all, that is the objective of our operation.
I think so, yes. If we scale back our measures now, that would amount to backing down. We should continue the inspections carried out by the Federal Police, the Coast Guard, and the military, and report any vessels that fail to cooperate at the international level.
But again, if a Shadow Fleet vessel refuses boarding, or if the Russian Navy prevents it, what do we do? Do we just report it and withdraw, or do we enforce the boarding?
A lot will depend on the military balance in the region, but we should be ready to take that next step. Simply reporting them will not be enough.
Then we need to take a long, hard look at ourselves, because that obviously could mean using live fire.
The Chancellor is now wrestling with a decision the blue team thought it had already made. Until this point, the assumption had been that Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland would join Germany in enforcing controls on the Shadow Fleet. But would they still do so if shots were fired? A unilateral German operation is out of the question.
If that is what the alliance decides, we are ready to have German ships enforce it.
But have we actually reached Article 5 yet? We have not. We still don't know whether the Americans will support it.
Exactly, Chancellor. I understood you to say that the Americans remain very hesitant. Article 5 hasn't been invoked yet.
This debate reveals something more fundamental. For decades, Germany was used to operating on the assumption that, in the end, the United States would underwrite the highest level of escalation. Now the blue team is weighing decisions that, in the worst case, could lead to a direct military confrontation, without clear backing from Washington.
The question is, what alternative options are actually available to us within the framework of the European Union? I think we now need to take a closer look at what our partners are realistically prepared to do.
The intelligence chief picks up on the foreign minister's point.
Another important question is to what extent we could form a coalition of the willing with the Scandinavian countries, in fact, with all the NATO allies around the Baltic Sea.
Definitely.
We've already seen Denmark and also Finland take fairly robust action. If all the Baltic allies started enforcing much stricter controls on the Shadow Fleet together, Russia would have to decide whether to push back or back down. That would turn it into a game of chicken, and that's exactly where we should take it.
In strategy, there's a concept known as the game of chicken. Imagine two drivers speeding straight towards each other. The first one to swerve loses. Each driver tries to convince the other that they will never back down. Of course, if neither driver gives way, they both crash. Military deterrence often works in much the same way. In the end, psychology is what matters. Meanwhile, the red team puts its plan into action and makes sure the whole world sees it. On a Russian state television channel aimed at an international audience, the message sounds like this.
Russia's Navy will now escort civilian vessels leaving Russian ports. This comes after attempts by NATO to stop Russian commercial shipping, a move that has been criticized as aggressive and illegal. Many of the oil tankers are carrying food for developing countries.
Russia claims the Shadow Fleet is transporting not only oil, but also food supplies for the global south. The message behind? If the West stops these ships, then Russia is not the aggressor. NATO is. Ultimately, however, from the Red Team's perspective, the Baltic Sea is a secondary theater. The real focus remains the corridor through Lithuania. Russia has created facts on the ground. Now the president wants to turn those military gains into a political reality. And he already has a plan for how to do that.
First, we'll send a civilian convoy with supplies and humanitarian aid. Russian media will be filming the whole thing, showing that there really are civilians there, that this is completely humanitarian. We'll do a massive PR operation around it.
Just for context, at this point, around 16,000 Russian troops are positioned along the corridor.
Yes, and we really need to send these civilians, the convoy, with women and with the Red Cross.
Can they follow immediately, as in today already?
Absolutely. Assuming, of course, that our forces haven't encountered any major delays.
You'll hear what that supposedly humanitarian convoy, complete with cameras and media spectacle, looks like in a moment. But first, let's return to the blue team. In Berlin, attention is now shifting to the Russian land corridor through Lithuania. The Chancellor contemplates under what circumstances Germany is prepared to use military force.
It seems necessary to me that we find a framework that does not merely consist of a coalition of the willing. Otherwise, I don't see how we can justify a deployment of the armed forces. If a German brigade is stationed in Lithuania for NATO, but NATO does not declare Article 5, and then they get entangled in combat, and we just let them fight, on what legal basis would that be?
At this point, the discussion revolves around two different questions. The first is legal. Can the Bundeswehr fight in Lithuania at all? The answer is yes. If Lithuania comes under attack, Germany is allowed to assist. International law recognizes both individual and collective self-defense. Germany's constitution also permits such a deployment. Parliament has to approve it, but in an emergency, that approval can come afterward. Legally, NATO's Article 5 is not required. Politically, however, it matters a great deal. That brings us to the second question. Under what framework is Germany willing to fight? On its own? As part of a European coalition? Or only if NATO acts as one? That question is much harder to answer.
To be a bit more casual here in our circle, we can't just say, well, the brigade happened to be there, so we figured we'd let them fight. That is no basis. We cannot justify that. So we need either a European solution or Article 5.
If NATO's collective defense clause is not invoked, and at this point that appears increasingly likely, Germany faces a dilemma. Berlin does not want to fight alone. A loose coalition of the willing is politically difficult. That leaves a third option, the European Union. The defense minister brings it up.
NATO's Article 5 is what Ukraine has been long seeking, collective defense. But, as the foreign minister pointed out, there is also a European option. That's Article 42.7 of the EU Treaty, which commits member states to provide all the military assistance they can.
The EU also has a mutual assistance clause. It states that if a member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, the other member states are obliged to provide aid and assistance by all means in their power. It has been only invoked once before. In 2015, after the terrorist attacks in Paris, France asked its European partners for support, primarily in the form of additional contributions to counterterrorism missions and other military operations. Germany responded by expanding its military deployment in Mali. In the Wargame, the Blue Team now discusses that option with the President of the European Commission.
Good afternoon to Berlin from Brussels.
He is played by David McAllister, a member of the European Parliament from Germany's Christian Democratic Union and chair of its Foreign Affairs Committee. In the Wargame, he gets straight to the point. Article 42.7.
This clause does not trigger an automatic military response. It does, however, require concrete and effective assistance. That assistance can take many forms: intelligence, military, political, or economic.
NATO's Article 5 carries much greater military weight. Once it is invoked, a vast military machinery is set into motion, with pre-existing operational plans and a unified command structure. The EU's mutual assistance clause is different. It is more like a commitment to provide assistance than an automatic military response. But precisely because of that, it is also easier to invoke.
Ultimately, however, it is up to the country under attack to invoke the clause. The other member states then decide on the nature and extent of the assistance they provide.
If Lithuania chose that route, the European Commission would play a coordinating role. The decision now rests with Lithuania. The call comes to an end.
Quite simply, the Lithuanians cannot imagine the European Union or the European member states stepping in to replace the United States.
That's the foreign minister.
Because, understandably, they are hoping that the United States will stay on board. But in my view, that does not relieve us from the responsibility of starting to think outside the box.
While the Blue Team is considering a European response, the NATO Secretary General calls Berlin. She wants to prevent Europe from acting on its own.
If we are not able to call Article 5, we can activate the defense plan and make sure that everybody is on the same position. That would, I think, send a stronger message than every capital wondering, are we acting under Article 5, under Article 42.7, or under what?
The United States still opposes invoking Article 5. But, she argues, NATO can act even without formally declaring collective defense, by activating its regional defense plans for the Baltic states.
My suggestion would be to activate for the first time the regional defense plan for the Baltic region and Central Europe, which will give more capabilities and troops to succor, including air defense and also deep strike capabilities.
Those plans run to more than 4,000 pages, and they are top secret. Russia is not supposed to know how NATO would respond in the event of war. What is publicly known is that activating the plans would give NATO's supreme allied commander in Europe broader authority to request and move forces. The plans also specify the land, air, maritime, space, and cyber capabilities needed to defend critical areas. In the Wargame, the NATO Secretary General says she will propose activating those plans later that day in the alliance's highest political decision-making body, where all member states must reach consensus.
I'm going to convene another extraordinary meeting of the North Atlantic Council at 1700.
In effect, she is trying to trigger the military consequences of Article 5 without formally invoking Article 5 itself. That matters, because Washington still opposes doing so. Activating NATO's defense plans does not require a separate vote, but it does require political consensus among the allies. The United States still has to be on board, not least because it provides capabilities that no other NATO ally can fully replace yet. Germany's defense minister has another proposal.
Have you already sought out the idea of activating Berlin Plus together with Turkey? In that way, de Sakier could lead an operation with NATO means for the European Union. We'd collectively combine European Union means and NATO means as we did in the Balkans until 2004.
Thank you, Minister. I think that's something that we can definitely consider.
After the call, the defense minister explains what that would mean in practice.
Berlin Plus is an agreement between the EU and NATO that allows them to cooperate closely. The basic idea is that the EU does not build any military capabilities where NATO already has them.
Under the Berlin Plus arrangements, the European Union can conduct military operations using NATO's command structures and capabilities. The last time this framework has been used was in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The EU mission Operation Althea helped maintain peace after the wars in the former Yugoslavia. Using this format would also reassure Washington that Europe is stepping up.
It would send a strong political signal of unity among NATO and EU member states. And it would also signal to the Americans that Europe understands burden sharing, that it's stepping up and taking on more responsibility.
The Blue Team is beginning to prepare for a Europe without America, even as it keeps the door open to US involvement. A quick note at this point. In the months since we ran the Wargame, that discussion has become real. European governments are coordinating more closely through new formats such as the E5, while the EU's Readiness 2030 initiative aims to strengthen Europe's ability to act more independently. After meeting the leaders of the Baltic states in Berlin in June, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz argued that NATO had to become more European in order to remain transatlantic. In the Wargame, the Chancellor and his ministers decide that, if Lithuania requests it, Germany will work with France and Poland to push for a European mutual assistance response. The foreign minister on the Red team is anything but pleased with that development.
We need to undermine this German objective. Our goal now is to prevent the EU from agreeing on activating the Solidarity Clause, Article 42. Now we need to activate Hungary, Slovakia, perhaps also the Czech Republic. And then there will be a number of other countries that will want to avoid further tensions. Spain, perhaps Portugal, Ireland, neutral countries like Austria.
A peaceful coalition for Europe's future.
The Red team's first move is to lobby Hungary, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, countries it describes as, quote, friends of peace. When we ran the Wargame, Viktor Orban was still Hungary's prime minister and widely seen as Moscow's closest partner inside the European Union. Since then, Hungary elected a new government, but the underlying logic remains the same. From Russia's perspective, exploiting political divisions within Europe is part of the strategy. Back to the Wargame. Later that same day, the convoy rolls through the Russian-controlled corridor in Lithuania. Cameras are filming. Reporters are on the scene. Russian soldiers escort the convoy. You may remember, this was part of the Red team's plan to give the corridor a humanitarian appearance. And once again, a quick reminder. Everything you are about to hear was generated with artificial intelligence.
Russian humanitarian convoys have entered the corridor today, delivering food and medical supplies to civilians in Kaliningrad.
I'm currently in Kaliningrad, talking to a pensioner who has been waiting for food aid for several weeks now. Sir, please tell me how you're feeling right now.
I am truly grateful to our brothers and sisters in Russia. They have not let us down. They think of us and help us when we need it the most.
Trucks, supposedly carrying food and medicine, drive bumper to bumper. Russian television reporters conduct interviews. The Russian Red Cross is there as well. The organization has been widely criticized internationally over allegations that it has blurred the line between humanitarian work and the Russian state's political and military objectives. Russian troops secure the corridor, but the cameras stay focused on civilians. That is exactly the message Moscow wants to send. The goal is to give its military operation political legitimacy, while discrediting any NATO response. Meanwhile, the blue team is busy putting the consequences of the state of tension into practice. That includes the return of conscription. For the defense minister, it means deciding which reservists should be called up for a refresher training. Among them are military police.
To support the police with traffic management and preparations for the movement of casualties and refugees. Second, communications and IT personnel.
They are responsible for cyber defense and for ensuring that reports, intelligence, and orders can be transmitted quickly and securely across the army.
Third, the mobilization of reservists for transport, logistics, and maintenance.
This is about keeping troops supplied with equipment, ammunition, fuel, and food. It also means carrying out repairs. For example, when a tank is damaged in combat, and transporting casualties and refugees.
Fourth, we've called up medical personnel.
The defense minister says that is easier said than done.
This is something we need to keep in mind more generally. Many people serve in multiple roles at the same time. medical staff who also work in care facilities, volunteer firefighters, and the Federal Agency for Technical Relief.
In other words, many of these people are listed for several different roles, but in the end, they can only perform one of them.
Fifth, together with the Association of German Chambers of Industry and Commerce, we've instructed all regional chambers to identify employees whose work is indispensable to their companies.
Those will be handed certificates confirming they cannot be called up for military service because their civilian job is considered indispensable. For example, because they work in critical infrastructure.
Another priority is safeguarding the electrical supply. That means protecting municipal utilities and power plants against sabotage.
May I chime in there? Does the Bundeswehr even have enough forces for that? Because to my knowledge, the Homeland Defence Forces are barely sufficient to guarantee the tasks outlined in the Operations Plan Deutschland for the German logistics hub, let alone serve as forces to protect our own critical infrastructure.
That's exactly why we're calling up more reservists and expanding refresher training.
Germany's operational plan is the military blueprint for turning the country into NATO's logistical hub in the event of war. It sets out how Allied troops and equipment would move across Germany, and how civilian authorities, critical infrastructure, and private companies would support that effort. For everything beyond that, such as protecting Germany's own critical infrastructure, additional personnel are needed. That is one reason why the defense minister now turns to reservists. There's a problem, though. All of these reservists need somewhere to stay.
We need to train far more people than we currently have accommodation for.
The Inspector General of the Bundeswehr proposes a temporary solution.
We can make use of existing military training grounds. We can also set up temporary container housing alongside existing barracks. That is one option we would need to pursue in parallel, including commissioning the necessary companies to put it into place.
Conscription is only one consequence of the state of tension. Another is the activation of Germany's emergency legislation. The head of the Federal Office of Civil Protection turns to the issue of medical care. In wartime, hospitals may have to reserve capacity for wounded soldiers.
Hospitals need to start switching into emergency operations now. Some patients needing ordinary treatments may have to wait a while. That would have very real consequences for the broader public. Hospitals would have to keep beds and staff in reserve, meaning ordinary procedures like hip replacements would suddenly have to be postponed.
Not everyone thinks those steps are necessary at this stage.
I agree that we need to prepare for it. That's absolutely right. But we are not yet in a direct military confrontation that would require us, for example, to start postponing hip replacement surgeries.
The Blue Team is working through one concrete measure after another. Reservists, hospitals, supplies. All of it matters, but the discussion remains highly tactical. The Interior Minister now steps back and raises a more fundamental question.
Can anyone at this table assess what the Russians actually want? What is their objective?
To make the Baltics Russian.
I'd rather say to demonstrate NATO and the EU's inability to act.
And then to make the Baltics Russian.
In the Wargame, the Red Team acts with a clear objective in mind and tells a story designed to help achieve that objective. Right at the start, in episode 1, the men in the Kremlin set out their strategic intentions. Remember this?
We want to fracture NATO's unity.
Our objective remains the same. We want a European security architecture that closely resembles the one in place in 1997, meaning no permanent NATO forces stationed in Eastern Europe.
The Blue Team, by contrast, never clearly defined its own objectives, nor did it spend much time thinking about Russia's strategy. That raises a fundamental question. Do we actually understand what the other side is trying to achieve?
I asked to speak because I'm increasingly getting the impression that when it comes to communications, especially with our own public, we are falling behind events. The more we act, the faster Russia turns his narrative against us.
Earlier, you heard how carefully Russia staged its military corridor in Lithuania for the cameras. The Interior Minister is worried that the Kremlin's narrative is beginning to take hold.
If you look at how this appears from the outside, Russia agreed to a ceasefire in Ukraine. It presents its military operation as a humanitarian corridor. It talks about NATO aggression and claims it has no choice but to protect civilian ships with military escorts. It spreads stories about so-called Russophobic actions by the West, and the United States, NATO, and the European Union appear extremely restrained. If something goes wrong now, we end up looking like the aggressor. I don't think we're doing enough in the information space. We're not explaining clearly enough what's actually happening.
The Chancellor responds.
When we talk about communication, what I envision is that you send a clear message saying, we will ensure that if worst comes to worst, the local energy supply is guaranteed. We will ensure that food is available. We will ensure that blankets and cots are provided if necessary. When push comes to shove, the state will be there for you, with firm, concrete, reliable measures that ensure people get through this crisis.
I think we urgently need our own narrative, and we need to systematically dismantle the Russian one. We won't keep public support for the government's decisions by simply reassuring people. We have to explain clearly what Russia is doing, how it's presenting its actions, and why that narrative is false.
On behalf of the federal government, you have my full backing doing that.
The blue team decides to turn the tables. It wants to regain control of the narrative. But then the situation shifts once again. Russia takes another military step. Germany moves troops. What that means for the balance of power in Europe, who ultimately comes out ahead, and how closely our wargame reflects reality, that's coming up in episode 5. This was Ernstfall. What if Russia attacks NATO? Inside a German wargame. The series consists of 5 episodes, published weekly. Episode 5 will be out on 22nd of July. If you have any questions or remarks, write us an email to wargame@welt.de. That's wargame@welt.de. Script and storytelling, Carolina Drüten and Antonia Beckermann. Production and sound design, Marvin Schwarz. Project leads, Antonia Beckermann, Carolina Drüten and Caroline Turzer. Research support, Jan Rosenkranz. Academic guidance, Josef Werbowski and Philipp Jan Schäfer from the German Wargaming Center at Helmut Schmidt University, the Bundeswehr University in Hamburg. Cover design, Dominik Schmidt. Our special thanks go to the participants of the wargame. David McAllister, Jörg Asmussen, Gerhard Konrad, Alexander Gabujew, Franz Stefan Gadi, Christiane Hoffmann, Roderich Kiesewetter, Bartłomiej Kott, Arndt Freitag von Loringhofen, Oana Lungescu, Irene Mihalic, Jeff Radke, Michael Roth, Peter Tauber, Christoph Unger and Eberhard Zorn. We're grateful to the fellow journalists who lent their voices to the English language version of our German participants' quotes. Daniel Düllenböhmer, Stephanie Bolson, Francis Dernley, Henry Donovan, Jacob Eckstein, Philip Fritz, Eric Kirschbaum, Chris Lunday, Nicholas Potter, James Rothwell, and Konstantin Schreiber. We would also like to thank the Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg for providing the venue, as well as Alan Edwards, Marlene Badun, Tobias Grabow, Till Henniges, Karl Hufnagel, Elias Jakob, Thorsten Kodalle, Nico Lange and Wim Ort for their support on site. And Nana Brink, Kai Brinkmann and Niels Lange for their valuable contributions to the conceptual discussions.